I realized my life was over the moment the system lockout message appeared on the screen, and I understood that I had tried to guess the password too many times, which meant only one thing. The home security system had sent a notification to the owner, and within minutes, someone would definitely come to check what was happening. At that moment, it still seemed to me that I was in control of the situation, that this was just an unpleasant technical glitch, that I would now find another way to delete the recording. Because the main problem wasn't the lockout, but what exactly I had been trying to delete. And the more seconds passed, the clearer I understood that if anyone from their family saw that video, it wouldn't just end in a scandal, but something much worse. I sat in front of the smart home control panel and felt everything inside me turning cold, because I already knew what was recorded there, knew every second of that recording, knew the moment when everything finally spiraled out of control, and knew that if anyone pressed play, there wouldn't be a single version of events left in which I looked like a person deserving of trust. The scariest thing at that moment wasn't even what had happened, but how it had all started so stupidly, senselessly, and randomly, the way almost all catastrophes begin, when no one plans to destroy their life, but everything falls into place in a way that makes it impossible to stop. The party started as an ordinary college party that Steve was throwing at his house because his parents often went away, and the house was big, with lots of rooms, music, alcohol, and people from college who came just to spend the evening. And I was there as his girlfriend, as someone who belonged to that group, who felt like part of that place. I remember that at first everything was normal, the usual noise, the usual conversations, the usual feeling that you're just spending the evening with people you know, and nothing foreshadowed the moment when your life would begin to slowly fall apart. I remember how Steve was busy the whole time because he was the host of the party, people constantly approaching him, asking questions, laughing, asking for more music. And I barely saw him for most of the evening, but that was normal because that's how these parties always went. I remember how everything gradually became more blurry because alcohol at these parties always works the same way. First, you just relax, then you start talking more than usual, then you start laughing at things that aren't even that funny, and at some point the boundaries between normal and stupid begin to disappear. I remember that his brother ended up next to me. We had known each other for a long time because I was often at their house, and there had never been anything strange between us. Nothing you could call tension or flirting. He was just part of Steve's family, someone who was always around. I still replay that moment in my head over and over, trying to understand where exactly everything went wrong, because catastrophes rarely begin with a single decision. Usually it's a chain of small mistakes that individually seem insignificant. I remember that we were just talking. I remember that the music was loud. I remember that we were both drunk. I remember that at some point we were alone. I remember how my brain wasn't working the way it should have at that moment. Because if I had thought even a second ahead, nothing would have happened. But that didn't happen, and one mistake became a second, and the second became a third. And at some point, something happened that couldn't be undone. At that moment, it seemed like something brief, stupid, almost unreal, as if it was happening not to me but somewhere off to the side. And when it was over, the first thought wasn't about what I had done, but that no one should find out about this. Because if Steve found out, everything would fall apart. And then I decided it would be a secret. The stupidest thought a person can have after a mistake is the thought that if no one finds out, you can just leave it in the past. I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake, that it was the alcohol, that it was a moment that would never happen again. But the problem was that I forgot one thing. This house wasn't just a house. It was packed with smart home systems, cameras, sensors, activity logs, and all of this was recording automatically. I only remembered this the next day, when my head had begun to clear, when memory started returning, when the feeling of shame began to slowly press on my chest. I was sitting in my room and suddenly realized that if the cameras were working, everything could have been recorded. At first, I tried to convince myself that no, that the cameras were only at the entrance, that they didn't record inside, that the system didn't save video. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that I was just trying to deceive myself. And then I decided to check. I knew where the system control panel was located. I knew how to open the interface. I knew that if a recording existed, it could be deleted. It seemed to me that this would take a couple of minutes. It seemed to me that no one would ever know about this. I opened the system, found the camera logs, and saw a file, date, time, and a small preview that showed enough to understand exactly what was recorded. Everything inside me collapsed. But I still thought I could fix everything. I just needed to delete the file. Only the system required an administrator password. I tried to guess. Then again. Then again. And only when the lockout message appeared and the automatic notification to the system owner did I truly understand for the first time that I had made not just a mistake. I had triggered a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. And somewhere at that moment, I heard the sound of a door opening and realized that someone had come to check who was trying to hack the system. And at that moment, my previous life ended. When I heard footsteps, something strange happened inside me, a state where fear and denial existed simultaneously, because part of my consciousness was still trying to convince me that it could be anyone, that this could just be a coincidence, that the person about to enter the room might not even understand what exactly had happened. But another part already knew that this was the end of any version of the future, where I continued to be Steve's girlfriend and part of his life. When the door opened, I was already sitting motionless in front of the screen, which still displayed the system lockout message. And the moment I turned my head, I saw his father, and his expression was so calm that at first I didn't even understand what was happening, because people usually react differently to attempts to hack their system. But he just looked at the screen, then at me, and in that pause, I felt something beginning to form inside. That was hard to describe in words, because it wasn't just guilt, but something heavier. The feeling that I was about to be completely exposed. He came closer and looked at the screen, then at the system log, where it was already visible which files had been opened and what deletion attempts had been made. And at that moment, I first understood how stupid my attempt to fix everything had been. Because every mistake I made was already recorded by the system. And even if I had been able to delete the video, traces of the attempt would still have remained. The strangest thing was that he didn't raise his voice, make sharp movements, or look like someone about to make a scene. And that made the situation even heavier because in the silence, his gaze became much scarier than any hysterics. He opened the recording. I couldn't make myself look at the screen, but I knew what was happening there because every second of that night was already in my head. And the moment he scrolled through a few seconds, I felt physically sick from the realization that everything I had tried to hide now existed not only in my memory. The most humiliating feeling at that moment wasn't just that I had cheated on Steve, but that it had happened with his brother. Because even if it had been someone else, the situation would have been terrible. But here, everything became even worse because it was destroying not just a relationship, but a family. He looked at the screen for a long time, then turned off the recording and looked at me again. At that moment, I was only expecting one thing, that he would say Steve needed to see this, that he would call him now, that everything would end in a scandal, shouting, accusations, and that moment when the truth destroys everything at once. But that didn't happen, and that became the beginning of the pressure that turned out to be much heavier than direct exposure. He said Steve shouldn't see this, and at first I didn't even understand what he meant, because it seemed obvious to me that this was exactly the case when the truth would come out anyway. But he looked at me as if he had already made a decision. He said that if Steve saw this, he would lose not only his girlfriend but his brother, and that would destroy the family. And he wasn't going to be the person who triggers such an explosion. And at that moment, I first felt a strange mixture of relief and horror. Because if he wasn't going to tell Steve, there was another plan, and that plan became obvious almost immediately. He said the only way to keep everything quiet was to make me disappear from his son's life, not gradually, not through explanations, but immediately. I had to break up with Steve. I had to disappear, without the truth, without explanations, without returning. And the longer he spoke, the more I understood that this wasn't an offer or a request. This was an ultimatum. He said that if I didn't do this myself, the video would be seen not only by Steve, but by the whole family, because the system stored copies of files, and it was impossible to delete them completely. I sat and felt a strange feeling of humiliation beginning to accumulate inside me, because at that moment I stopped being a person who had simply made a terrible mistake. I became a problem that needed to be removed from the family's life. But the hardest thing wasn't even that. The hardest thing was that part of me understood that he was right. If Steve saw this video, everything would fall apart. And in this story, there wouldn't be a single version where I could explain what happened in a way that he would understand me. I tried to speak, tried to explain that it was a mistake, that it was the alcohol, that it wasn't something I had planned. But the more I spoke, the clearer I understood that my words sounded pathetic even to myself. He listened calmly, and then simply repeated that I had a choice: disappear quietly, or let the truth destroy everything. When I left that room, I had the feeling that I was no longer in my own life. Everything became unreal. I saw Steve later that evening. He was normal. He knew nothing. He was smiling. He talked to me the same as always. And at that moment, I felt such a strong feeling of shame that it became difficult even to look at him. But the strangest thing was that inside me there still existed a small hope that somehow I could survive this situation, that I could come up with an explanation, that I could break up without destroying everything completely. I thought that if I just left his life, the truth would remain hidden. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to understand that everything was already destroyed. Because relationships where you live with a secret of this magnitude cease to be real. And when I was finally alone, a thought hit me that became the beginning of the real fall. I realized that even if I left and did everything his father demanded, it didn't mean the truth would never surface. It just meant I would live with this fear, constantly. And for the first time since everything happened, I felt not just guilt. I felt complete loss of control over my life. And at that moment, it became clear to me that no matter what I did next, I had already lost. After the conversation with his father, my life turned into a strange state of constant tension, where every morning began with the same thought that I had to disappear from Steve's life. But at the same time, every time I saw his message or heard his voice, there arose a feeling that I was standing on the edge of a decision that would change not only my life, but his. And the longer I delayed, the stronger the pressure inside me became, because I understood that silence doesn't solve the problem. It just postpones the moment when everything finally collapses. I tried to act normal, but it was impossible, because now every interaction with Steve turned into an internal conflict, where one part of me said I had to do what his father demanded, and another part said I had no right to destroy a relationship without explanation, because then it would be another lie, another betrayal, just of a different type. The strangest thing was that Steve noticed nothing. He continued to live in his version of reality where everything was normal, where he had a girlfriend he trusted, where his brother was just a brother, and the family remained a family. And every time he talked about the future, there arose a feeling inside me that I was looking at a world that existed only because the truth was still locked inside the smart home system. I tried to convince myself that the decision was simple. I just had to leave. Say the relationship wasn't working, that I had other plans, that I no longer felt the same. Any version of a lie seemed easier than the truth. But the problem was that I knew if I left without explanation, Steve would look for a reason. He would think he had done something wrong. He would try to fix everything. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt I was becoming a person who destroys someone else's life, not just with one mistake, but with the consequences of that mistake. And it was at this moment that a person appeared who became that very source of information that completely changed my understanding of what was happening. It was his brother. After that night, we barely communicated. Between us hung a silence that was heavier than any conversation because each of us understood what had happened and understood that neither had a good way out of this situation. But one day he wrote to me. The message was short. He said we needed to talk. I looked at the screen for a long time before responding, because part of me wanted to simply ignore him, as if by not contacting him, everything would disappear on its own. But another part understood that he was the only person who knew the same truth as I did. When we met, I expected to hear anything: accusations, a panicked attempt to hide everything, or conversely, an attempt to blame everything on me. But the conversation went in a completely different direction. He said his father had talked to him. And at that moment, everything inside me sharply contracted, because I understood what that meant. It meant I wasn't the only person who had been given an ultimatum. He said his father had told him almost the same thing he had told me, that Steve shouldn't find out, that the family shouldn't fall apart, that the only way to save everything was to remove me from this story. And the moment I heard this, a strange feeling appeared in me that at first I couldn't even properly define. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to realization. Because until that moment, I had thought all the pressure was directed only at me, that I was the only problem, that if I disappeared, everything would return to normal. But now it became clear that the situation was much more complicated. His brother said that his father didn't want to destroy the family, but he also didn't want the truth to come out, because then it would be impossible to preserve the relationship between the brothers. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became that in this story, everyone was trying to protect their version of the future. The father protects the family, the brother protects himself, and I had to become the person who simply disappears. But at some point, the conversation turned in a direction I wasn't prepared for. He said there was a problem, and the problem was that the smart home system stored not one recording, it stored an archive. And if his father had seen one recording, that didn't mean there weren't others. And at that moment, I first felt real fear, because this meant the whole story could be much longer than one moment of mistake. He said he had checked the system and found more files, files showing us leaving the room, files showing the time, files showing what happened before and after. And this meant that if someone decided to check everything fully, nothing could be hidden. And then I understood one more thing. His father wasn't just protecting the family, he was controlling the situation. Because as long as the truth was with him, he decided who knew and who didn't. And at that moment, a change occurred inside me that became the first real transformation since the beginning of this story. I suddenly realized that until this moment, I had only thought about how to save my relationship with Steve, or at least not destroy his life too much. But no one in his family had thought about me. To them, I was just an element that needed to be deleted. And it was then that for the first time a thought appeared that perhaps I was no longer obligated to play by their rules. Because if the truth existed anyway, if the recordings weren't going anywhere, if control of the situation was with a person who had already decided my fate without my participation, then the only thing I had left was the choice of how exactly this truth would one day come out. And at that moment, I first stopped feeling simply guilty. I began to feel anger. And this anger meant only one thing. The story wasn't over yet. When I wrote to Steve that we needed to talk, I already knew this conversation would become the point after which there would be no way back. But even understanding this, inside me there still lived the habitual human weakness, that part of consciousness that desperately seeks a way to soften the blow, change the wording, twist the facts so they sound less destructive. I caught myself thinking that while waiting for his response, I was scrolling through different versions in my head of how to tell the truth and at the same time not destroy everything at once. I thought about saying that we had fought and I needed time, thought about confessing only partially, hiding details, even thought about doing again what his father had demanded of me, just ending the relationship without explanations and disappearing. But the closer the moment of meeting came, the more I understood that if I started lying again now, I would simply continue the same chain of mistakes that had led me here. When we finally met, Steve looked the same as always. He felt no danger, expected no catastrophe. For him, this was an ordinary conversation with a girl he loved and trusted. And that made everything heavier, because the calmer he was, the stronger the feeling grew inside me that in a few minutes, I would destroy the world of a person who didn't even suspect he was already living in a lie. At first, I tried to speak carefully. I said we needed to discuss something serious, that lately I had been feeling bad, that after that party much had changed. Words came out of me slowly, and the longer I spoke, the clearer it became that I was walking around the truth, as if hoping it would somehow become softer on its own if I didn't speak it directly. Steve listened attentively, but at some point I saw confusion appearing in his gaze, because my words weren't adding up into a coherent picture. He was trying to understand what exactly I was talking about, and that became the moment when I first felt how pathetic my attempts to wriggle out sounded. I started saying that at that party I had been too drunk, that I remembered much poorly, that a situation had occurred, which I regretted. Even speaking these words, I felt I was still holding part of the truth inside myself, because the scariest detail still remained unspoken. I caught myself trying to construct the story as if the mistake had been abstract, as if it had no specific face, as if it could be left in the shadows. But the longer I did this, the stronger the feeling became that I was trying to hide again. Steve started asking questions, and each question made the situation heavier, because he was trying to understand what exactly had happened. And I understood that any evasive explanation only delayed the inevitable moment. He asked if it was related to someone at the party, and at that moment I felt everything inside me contracting, because this was the question I had feared hearing most of all. I tried again to avoid a direct answer, started talking about how everything was chaotic, how alcohol had ruined everything, how I hadn't controlled the situation. But even speaking these words, I already knew they wouldn't save me. At some point, I stopped, because I understood a simple thing. If I continued speaking like this, I would just slowly destroy his trust, and the truth would break through anyway, only in an even more ugly way. And then I did what I had feared from the very beginning. I said that at that party I had ended up alone with his brother. I said that we were both drunk, and that a moment occurred which should never have happened. I said it was a mistake, that it didn't last long, that it wasn't something I had planned or wanted. But at the same time, I understood that no explanations changed the main fact. When I spoke his brother's name, I saw his expression change. First, there was disbelief, as if the brain was trying to reject information that too sharply broke the familiar picture of the world. Then came silence, heavy and dense, because the words had already been spoken and couldn't be taken back. At that moment, I felt that everything really was collapsing, because between us disappeared that invisible foundation on which any relationship is built. But the truth didn't end there, and I understood that if I stopped now, I would leave another layer of lies. So I forced myself to continue. I told him about the smart home system, about the cameras, about how the next day I realized everything could have been recorded. I told him how I found the file in the system and tried to delete it. I told him how I tried to guess the password and how the system locked up. I told him about that moment when his father entered the room and saw everything on the screen. Each new sentence made the air heavier, because now it wasn't just about infidelity, but about how this story had long gone beyond the limits of our conversation. I told him that his father had watched the recording and said Steve shouldn't find out about this. I told him he had decided to keep everything secret for the sake of the family. And finally, I said what put the final period. I said that he was the one who demanded I break off the relationship and disappear from his life. When these words were spoken, nothing remained inside me but exhaustion. I no longer tried to justify myself or ask for forgiveness, because I understood that in such a situation, any request sounded empty. I simply laid everything out as it was, from beginning to end, without trying to hide details. After that came a silence, in which there was neither relief nor hope. I knew I had just destroyed the life of a person who until this moment had trusted me. But at the same time, I understood that for the first time in all this time, I had stopped living inside someone else's script. And it was in this silence that it became clear that the real blow for Steve was only beginning. After I finished speaking, a silence came that was heavier than any scream. In that silence, I first truly saw what I had done. Not in theory, not as an abstract mistake, but as the real destruction of the life of the person sitting across from me, who was trying to comprehend several things at once. Infidelity, brother, video, father, pressure, lies. And the scariest thing, that everyone around already knew more than he did, even though he was the one this concerned most of all. Steve didn't react the way people do in movies. There was no flash of rage, no sharp words. There was only the expression of a person in whose head too many supports were collapsing simultaneously. I saw how he was trying to connect past memories with what he had just heard, the party, the morning after, my strange attempts to act normal, that I was beside him and silent. And somewhere among these thoughts now appeared a new figure, his own brother. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and almost empty. In these words, there was no attempt to find justification, no desire to hear additional explanations. There was only one question that at that moment turned out to be more important than everything else. He asked why I had decided to tell him this now, when I could have simply disappeared as his father wanted. I answered honestly because by this point there was no sense in inventing new versions. I said that at first I really had planned to leave, to say the relationship wasn't working anymore, and let him live on without this truth. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that then I would again be making the choice for him. I would again leave him in a world where everyone around knew more than he did. I said I wasn't asking for forgiveness, because I understood that in such a situation, words changed nothing. I simply didn't want his life to continue inside someone else's version of reality. After that, the conversation almost ended by itself. He asked no more questions, didn't try to find out details, didn't speak about the future. And at some point, it became clear that between us, there was nothing left that could be discussed. I left. Several months have passed since then, and during this time, I learned only fragments of what happened next. I know Steve talked to his brother. I know a conflict occurred in the family that none of them had expected. I know his father tried to stop this conversation because he understood where it would lead. I don't know all the details. And honestly, I no longer try to find them out. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had done what was demanded of me. If I had simply disappeared. Perhaps Steve would now be living a calm life, thinking his girlfriend had simply stopped loving him. Perhaps his relationship with his brother would have remained the same. Perhaps his family would still look perfect. But then all that reality would exist only because the truth had been buried. And here's the question that still won't let me rest. I destroyed a person's life by telling the truth, but if I had remained silent, would that life have been real?